Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome Rocky Roland, long-established Association of Lifelong Learners presenter, traveler extraordinaire, spy unparalleled, to address in part, I hope, what Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld so colorfully called the unknown unknowns. Chaos. Is there a way to plan for it?
Thank you, sir. Okay, well, I'll give it for Glenn's benefit here too. We have one in-house person right now, maybe more, and 5 Zoomers. And so in-house, you ask a question whenever. Stop, do thing when it's hot on your mind, so we don't beam past and then try to recall it later. For those people on Zoom, it's probably easier, unless it's a critical thing, if you hold your questions till the end. And then we'll repeat them for the recording and for everyone else's benefit, because they may or may not be able to see your input or hear your inputs, and then try to answer them. And you can always, you can come with a voice query, or also you can type in a comment or a question at any time if you're on Zoom. But please don't forget them, write them down, do something, so we try to answer all those kinds of things. So next slide, Ron. Okay, and of course, you always have to start off by bounding your problem or talking about what it is you're going to talk about. What's the actual topic here today? And one of the confusing things out there is, and the reason that got me interested in doing this presentation is that the word chaos has been bandied about all the time recently. It seems like every situation in the world or in the United States is being described in the media as descending into chaos. And so that may or may not be true, as we're going to find out when we go through this presentation a little more and talk about what chaos actually is. And then what is the difference between crisis, which is in no way necessarily chaotic, and then chaos itself, which is a little more interesting to try to handle. Next slide, Ron. Here we've got some basic ideas about the differentiating between a crisis and chaos. And one of the main things about a crisis is the fact that you still have a pretty good understanding about what's happening. The logic of causality is still in place, but you may not understand it in a crisis. But it's there, and you will be able to identify situations so that if you do X, then Y is probably going to happen. And that's differentiates from chaos in quite a big way. Then also in a crisis, there's always the situation where there is hope, the concept of hope. We have the power to learn and categorize what's going on. We have the power to react, and we can actually change the vector of a crisis. And we may or may not be able to do that in chaos. As a matter of fact, probably cannot change the vector. So that's crisis. Now, a very short definition of chaos is a state of extreme confusion and disorder. And so that pretty well sums it up. And the key words there are extreme. Extreme confusion. No one that's involved in that scenario or in the situation can really understand what's happening. And so it comes from Greek, which is chasm or void, or the formlessness at the beginning of the cosmos before it's created. In math or in science, there is the more formal mathematical chaos theory. And what that essentially boils down to is you have a very active system, very dynamic, super dynamic system, so that even the smallest forms of input, if they're in the right place at the right time, can create massive effects either downstream or in another part of the system. And so the magnitude of the input bears no relation in many cases to the magnitude of the output. In the upper right part of the slide, the most common folklore type saying about the chaos is the butterfly effect. Of course, this was, in Jurassic Park. This is one of the things they talked about, where when a dynamic system goes haywire, and that's probably a pretty good example of the start of chaos in some of that in the first movie of Jurassic Park. You have the butterfly effect, which is of course described as a butterfly in Brazil can flap its wings and cause a hurricane in Florida. That's kind of the theory behind the butterfly effect, and it's absolutely a misstatement of chaos theory, but it's become very, very common to hear that used to describe it. Next one, Ron. Okay, so here we have, we're going to talk quite a bit throughout this talk about an item called context, which is absolutely critical to any situation, whether it be chaos or any other situation you find yourself in. That situation and the input, output, and dynamics of the situation are always 100% related and dependent upon the context that you start in. And so some of the most important things you can do is understand your context, understand what your starting point is, where you're at. I thought this was kind of a cute left-hand part of the slide, is a pretty good representation, it always depends on your individual perspective what the context is. For instance, what for the spider seems like normal everyday life and the most simple of affairs is not such to the fly. Once the fly touches the web, all bets are off, and the fly no longer has any concept of what to do, what's going to happen next, and the system that he's even operating in. So that's kind of an interesting thought and a way to put it. Next slide, please, Ron. This is a kind of a graphic depiction. Of course, it's not all seeing, all knowing depiction of what all the contributions that go into context, or in this case, it's called stimulus in the center, is what are you getting input from as you make decisions, react, or act at the time. And there's a whole list of things around the outside of the center there that go in to what you personally perceive as what's happening now in the situation. And the interesting thing, of course, is that those inputs are different for every single person based on their experience, their life, and their knowledge and study and expertise. And so another reason why you sometimes, as we talk about later, need to develop teams or rely on experts, because they have a whole different context, idea, set of resources than you do. And hopefully you can expand your context by somebody who can fill in the voids where you don't have any knowledge or any idea. Next, Ron, please. So what's going on in the world right now? We see headlines every day about, and many of these things, they talk about descending into chaos, which is not really true. In just about any of these descriptors on this slide, so far, none of those really fit the definition of chaos, but they certainly fit the definition of crisis, which means we've lost control of the situations. We have no really good way to influence the situation. It doesn't fit our normal idea set, and we got to do something quick if we want to react to it. We don't have time to analyze, develop new knowledge, and react when you're in a crisis situation. The import of this slide, or what I'm trying to show, is in the banner at the bottom of the slide, is will these multiple crises, and these are not the only ones that we are facing here in the United States or in the world. There's a whole bunch more that we could pile on here if they'd be visible on the slide. But this is probably the first time in in recent memory when we've had so many different things that are in crisis mode at one time. And so it is possible to get overwhelmed by the crises, and then they can, as a joint factor, can make you descend into chaos where you have no idea what's going on, because the normality of each one of these systems then disintegrates also at the same time. And everything you thought was normal goes away. Next slide. However, and probably the big premise of this whole presentation is, in nearly every scenario, no matter how simple, how complex, and even in chaos, there are certain methods that you can use, certain ideas, certain planning strategies that will make a difference. And so if you have some idea of how to react or do the right thing, you have a much better chance of having success, achieving whatever goals you have set for yourself in the particular scenario that you find yourself. And so that's what we hope to do as we get all the way through the presentation, is come up with some ideas that say, okay, if you really truly find yourself, as we say, as pilots, out of airspeed and ideas, then what next? What do you do? Next slide, Ron. This is a framework that I'm going to use for the next several slides to help us work our way to chaos as far as the type of a scenario that you find yourself in. And this is pronounced a cúnavin. Cúnavin, it's a Welsh word, and of course, nobody can speak Welsh. Even the Welsh people have trouble speaking Welsh. So that's why, we have these various letters and it doesn't sound anything like it looks. This framework has become very well established in scientific and the business community as a very reliable framework to help individuals at all levels of decision-making improve their planning and execution skills. And it's just an idea of what's involved at various levels of all the way from the simple to the most complex and then into chaotic. What's different about each one of those, and how do you have to change as a person to react, to plan, and to act, to work your way to improve the situation that you're in. And we're going to go through this in some detail. Next run. But this Cúnavin framework is an outgrowth of another mathematical theory, which I'm not going to go into because I'm not an engineer or a math guy on this particular thing. But it's called complexity theory, which is an outgrowth of chaos theory, and the two work together. And this Cúnavin strategy and idea was generated out of complexity theory, so it's mathematically based. It's based in logic and math as far as its inception. And that's what we're going to try to look at as we go. Next, please, run. So it starts off with Cúnavin, and remember we had 4 different little colored segments to our graphic there a while back, but Cúnavin really starts off with 3. These 3 here: complex, ordered, and chaotic. Next slide, Ron. And then over the years, as this was first introduced, it quickly was expanded. In other words, they shredded out the ordered part of these events into 2 sub-elements, one they call simple and one they call complicated, and both of those being ordered systems or ordered events. And that's how we end up with 4. Next run.
Ordered or chaos, not a subset of complex.
We'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so you end up with these 4 domains, is what they're called inside the Cúnavin theory. And on the right-hand part are ordered or predictable. And this is really the reason that answers your question. On the right-hand side, cause and effect is in effect, works, and is identifiable and understandable. As we talked about in the introduction, okay, what about the unknown unknowables? Well, the unknown unknowables are at the bottom left in chaos. In complexity, they're the unknown knowables. Okay, in complexity there. So you can, in a complex situation, there are things that can be known. You just don't know them. And you have to work to figure out what they are, how to identify them, and how things. And so that's why they don't fit in. The things over here fit because you can identify them and you can know them on the right-hand side. The cause and effect is in place and you can recognize it. In the left-hand side, in complex, cause and effect is still in place. You just can't recognize it. in most of the scenarios. And in chaos, cause and effect is not in place. There is some order, and we're going to talk about that, but trying to identify cause and effect doesn't work in the chaotic system. So that, does that answer, Glenn? Okay. All right. So on to the next one, Ron. So here we're going to talk about the first one on the lower right there in the little square diagram. This is the simple, or they've also added, they being the experts in this field of planning, have added another nomenclature to that. Also, they call it obvious sometimes. This is the state we want to get to. As human beings, we like things to be in this state. We like to be them to be under control. Our options are clear. We've been here before. Things are predictable. Cause and effect is apparent to everyone. We don't have any part of our group or our team that's in the dark. They all recognize what the cause and effect is. And because of that, we are able to put processes, checklists, organizational items in place to handle this on almost an automatic basis. You see this situation, this will handle it. Step through these procedures, it'll get you through. That's the simple thing. Responses often become habitual or automatic because of that. Because I've seen that before, so you push lever B. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit when we talk about falling off the cliff and Olin's contribution earlier in this morning's briefing on this. So what do you have to do in the simple? You assess the situation, which means you just look at it and identify what's going on. It's obvious to you what's going on, so it doesn't require any more analysis, thought, or investigation. And then you respond with the best practice, which you've already developed. Because you've been here before, you know what the cause and effects are. You have something that says this is what you're supposed to do in that scenario. So that's called best practice. And we're going to see how that nomenclature changes as we work our way around this diagram.
We're going to talk about staying within the data.
Well, no, not specifically. Don't get me in this math business here. You know, we're talking general leadership skills here. You can't stay. You don't know if you're within the data or not once you get past complicated. So you don't. You can say that, but you don't have any idea whether you're within or without. In this one, you are within, and you stay within.
Let's talk sociology based.
It's not mathematically based. Correct. It's not mathematically based. Now the dangers, what are the dangers? There are dangers to individuals or a group's reaction in any one of these four states. The dangers in this one is that obvious context may be oversimplified. This is what Roland told us about in his little anecdote this morning. He was in what he thought was absolutely a simple or obvious situation. He'd been there before. He knew which lever to pull. This is what you do in this kind of scenario, and it blew up on him. Okay, because he obviously overlooked part of the context he didn't have. Other members in his system and the things that made this thing tick, which is the concrete technology group in ACC, didn't agree with what he thought. And so it didn't work on the thing, even though he thought it should have. The other danger is past success makes you complacent. Same thing happened there with him, because this has always worked. When you pulled lever B, it always worked. So you do get in a rut where you think it's going to work. And then that's essentially the same thing with the last one. You just are overconfident. You get overconfident in a situation and it doesn't work. Next run. And so then what happens? Now it degenerates. Each one of these is a degeneration. And we're going to talk later about what our preferred path is inside this whole four domain area. Is we want to be going clockwise all the time. And what happens is the world atrophy in a chaotic system or in any system wants to drive us counterclockwise. It wants to take us out of the simple, and we are trying to drive everything always back to the simple. So these two things conflict with each other. When you get into this region, into the blue region here, complicated problems, there might be several solutions that are okay, that work. There may not be one that sticks out as the best solution. It may take too much time to try to reduce it down to get to the best solution. Cause and effect are still clear, but not to everyone. So half your team sees the cause and effect, half your team doesn't see cause and effect, and that's a problem inside your team. Because now you're trying to resolve that and get everybody on the same page, and it doesn't necessarily work because half your team doesn't see it. That's why it now becomes complicated, because you've got half of your guys that have to do these individual tasks and they don't get it on the thing. And here you have to do one more step after you assess. Now you have to analyze and say, okay, what happened? Why don't we know what's happening? Why don't you see this cause and effect? What can we do now that doesn't fit our original model on the thing? So what do? You assemble your team with a wider expertise than you originally had. You try to find somebody that's smarter than you to pull them into the team. And it can be within your own organization, or what they say, this is the blue part of this fourth divisional graphic. The blue part is the domain of experts. This is the part of this graph where you now have the opportunity and should, if it makes sense, get an expert to help you. And that expert more than likely is not from your own organization. It's from somewhere else that you pull this thing in. And then you have to decide on a best response, which means you got to collaborate. You have to get this team together and you have to decide on the response. There's no longer a direct command decision on this. So now that makes it more complicated, because you got to convince people to come to some kind of a corporate decision. A lot harder to do than just having the boss say, do this.
Isn't always the best solution.
Not necessarily. Sometimes the boss's solution is best. We're going to talk about that when we get to the next one. Complex is oftentimes you don't know until hindsight that you screwed up, because you didn't recognize what some parts of what was going on. And in this one, your responses, this goes to what Glenn just said, they should employ good practices, not best practice, because it may not be the best thing. But you got to do something. You got to fix this situation. Does this fit within our ethical and financial and dynamic framework? Can we do this and get it done? And will it essentially solve the problem? Okay, let's do it. It's good enough. Get that thing going. That's in thing. Now, what are the dangers? Over-reliance on experts. So you consult an expert, you get one to come in, and somebody in the organization decides that they carry 75% of the weight and the people over here carry 25%, and that's maybe wrong. You may be giving too much weight to the expert. So you have to be really careful inside your organization about over-relying on the expert. And then the second thing that we talked about this morning in some detail in other comments is you often overlook the input of creative or divergent dissenters within your own organization, because they tend to get put in their own little category and, oh, that person's a pain in the butt. All they do is whine and bring up crap that never goes anywhere. And so they get cocooned, and their inputs don't get listened to. And they may have the best inputs out there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that goes in the whole thing, is that they're not willing to grow the dramatic step. That's the good practices. So they're not willing to go that dramatic step. Yeah, that's very, very common, that they're not willing to make that. We're going to talk about it a little bit later when we get to crisis. And you can have a crisis in simple, complicated, complex, and chaos. Those can be in every one of those categories. You can have a crisis. And we're going to talk proportionality here later on in the thing, and that's what happens. Sometimes you have to bring out the hammer at the time when it doesn't look like it should call for a hammer, but you have to bring it out. Okay, next run. Now we're into complex, and this is where things get really interesting. And actually, as you, in today's world, this is a very large majority of systems are complex, and it has to do with globalization. You know, we, over the last X number of years, pick a number of years, we as the world have become interdependent on each other to extreme degrees. And that's for everything, for information, for hardware, for raw materials, for knowledge, for experts, for people who have been educated in certain areas. We don't have those within individual countries anymore. They relied on them to come in. So it becomes now every situation in those types of dynamic systems almost by default are complex out there. They don't fit. It might be impossible to find one best solution in a complex scenario. Cause and effects are understandable. They are understandable. And that's the thing we were talking about earlier. In a complex scenario, you can understand, you can finally figure out what's causing this, but you may not figure that out until you've already failed at one level. It may be only in hindsight, like you pick this, you were talking, pick this option, looked pretty good, boom, fails. Then you have your after action. So, well, what went wrong? And you're able to figure out what went wrong. And now the light bulb comes on, you see the cause and effect, come up with a new plan, and the second time it works. So that's complex scenarios where the first time you may not see what's going on, but in hindsight, after a failure, now you recognize what's going on. Go ahead.
If you knew the answer, you want to have to do an experiment.
Well, it talks here, be patient, probe and experiment, okay, because you don't know. You don't know for sure what's going to work or not work. You have to be patient. Non-apparent patterns. These start to show up in complex scenarios where now everybody has trouble seeing these patterns, not just before where it was a mixture. Everybody has trouble seeing the patterns, but there are patterns. There are patterns. And of course, there are patterns in chaos too, but they're 10 times harder to figure out than they are in complex scenarios. You have to understand your what? Your context. You have to understand your context. You have to build a new knowledge base. This is a thing and that's a continual thing. Every organization, every person, everything is in this kind of scenario, in complex scenarios, you have to always be building your knowledge base. You have to be increasing it all the time. You have to take your results of experiments, your results of failures, your results of successes and roll them back into your knowledge base. And then there's two kinds of knowledge that I didn't know these technical words before I started researching for this presentation, but there's tacit knowledge and then explicit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is a knowledge owned by an individual in their own head. And they've developed this knowledge and this context and this usefulness over their entire life. And they can pass that knowledge on, but only in person. They have the ability to interact with other people and pass that knowledge on, but it's not clear to them or anybody else. They may not have the capability to write it down in an understandable manner where other people can use it in a written form. So a lot of knowledge resides in people's heads out there. And then explicit knowledge is something we all have to work on to get it out of their heads and get as much of it as we can down in black and white so it can be passed on. And the second part of that is develop mentor programs so that you're building new tacit knowledge. So when your old guy goes away, you've been training a new guy or gal in there who now has it in their head and is able to continue working on. And then here, the last one in the kind of the peach colored stuff, in this scenario, in complex scenarios, often you'll settle for what's good enough. That's good enough. Okay, we're not dying here. The whole thing's not blowing up. This is going to work. Okay, we want it to work 100 times. This looks like it'll do 75. Let's roll. Otherwise, we're not going to make our goal. We're not going to do it. So this is good enough. Let's go. So you have to be willing to settle for good enough. Dangers. Same thing in every one of these. What worked before may not work now. You can't get trapped in your own knowledge and in your own context. This is the biggest thing we're seeing now out here in the globalization and in complex systems is rapid, accurate communication fails out there. It always fails. Then that causes isolated thinking. because the people, the members of your team are not communicating, not because they don't want to, because those links are gone. And then also this bottom one, and we're seeing this particularly in COVID now, but it's always a factor in organizations, is personnel turmoil dilutes tacit knowledge. So if you lose a key individual, whether it be to COVID, sickness, health, transfer, things, it can really hurt your group, your key, your thing, because you lose that, or they say, screw it, I'm done. I've had it with you guys. All that tacit knowledge goes away, and you don't have a way to replace it. So that's another real danger that leaders and things should be more careful about protecting that tacit knowledge resources in their organizations, which doesn't always happen. Next run. This one, Glenn and I have talked about this one a little bit before in another venue, but nature, and this is out of the mathematical complexity theory and chaos theory, is nature is always self-organizing. Even though we don't look like it, and even though the person next to you doesn't look like it's organized and you don't see it, it's organizing in its own right. And these are some examples you see here, the schools of fish. And I told this morning, and snorkeling in the Caribbean, which I've done many, many times, and I can't count the number of times where a big school of thousands of fish have come swimming by right where I'm at, and you get completely surrounded by this school of fish, and you can't touch them. You can reach out, you can't touch them. They don't touch you. They move around, they don't touch each other, and away they go. And that's just an awesome thing. That's nature self-organizing. And then these things on the graph here give you some other examples of how detailed the organization can be. But if you're in the middle of it, you don't see that. You don't see any. It's hard to get far enough away to see the organization. Next run, please. And now finally, we're into kind of the basic topic that we're going to talk about for the rest of the thing, and that's chaotic systems. And this is the domain of rapid response, but it's not rapid response like rapid response in a complex. This is rapid response to save your life. And I don't mean necessarily from death. I mean from your organizational perspective and your ability to function and do whatever goal you have. This is something to just build an area, a protective wall around yourself and survive whatever's happening at the time. In this one, there's no apparent relationship at all between cause and effect. And again, the word apparent is there, except even after the fact, you can't see it. It's not there. You're not going to find the cause and effect in chaos. Now, there is some relationship there, as mathematical theory of chaos shows us. When you get far enough away from the item, even at the molecular level or things, you see organization that's happening. But you got to get far enough away to see it. And you've already been successful if you now can get far enough away to see it in a chaotic situation, because you've gotten yourself out of the chaotic situation to be that far enough away. Of course, your first goal of confusion reigns. The first goal is to establish order, but you can't establish order in the whole system or in the problem. That doesn't work. This is chaos. You can't change it. It's whatever's happening is gonna happen around you. So the way you can establish order is in yourself, in your own space and time. So right around you, and by you, I don't mean an individual, although it can be, but it's individuals and organizations and groups and countries. You have to stop, build your boundaries, set your time limits, and establish order for yourself, and not worry what's going on around you other than to protect yourself from it.
So that's every like the butterfly effect.
How is that like it?
How does that reflect? That means you're going to change the end result.
Well, yeah, but you don't know that. Well, I mean, you do if that's true, but nobody knows if that's true. And so it's like, killing yourself in time travel or whatever. I mean, who knows what really happens down the thing. But if you don't do something, it doesn't matter anyway. I mean, you have to do something to protect yourself and your organization. Now, the idea is you want to transfer back, once you establish this order, you want to transfer back to some form of stability. Even complex systems, there's order. People recognize cause, they recognize what's going on. It's very complex, but everybody can look at it and see what's happening. In chaos, not so. You don't have any idea what's happening. So now you're trying to expand your boundary and establish more and more order and transfer that area back to stability inside the thing. And then again, the same thing, back to knowable causes and effects. So you establish this boundary, and now you try to create a system where once and again, the causes and effects you know and can understand. You may not know them in the area right outside the boundaries that you've established. Reliable information is critical, and it's going to be almost impossible to find. That's the most difficult thing about chaos is you cannot find reliable information because nobody knows. It's confusion to everyone that's going on. And so what you have to do is be critical of the information you do get and try to vet it and make sure that it's as accurate as it can be. And then we talk about here the very last thing in the kind of steps of things you can do is you have a crisis plan, which doesn't have anything to do with chaos. This is assuming that you can create enough order, stability, and time and space around yourself to implement your plan. And what that'll do is save you from going through those thought processes and saves you more time. And so your whole idea when you're in the chaotic scenarios is to buy time. Whatever you do, everything you do is to buy time so that you can then react in a more stable, directed manner.
So that's saying you're not going to get rid of the chaos.
You cannot get rid of the chaos. You don't know when it's going to end. Nobody can predict when it's going to end in a chaotic system. Nobody can predict when it's going to end. You don't know when it's going to end. You're just trying to develop an area where you can survive, live, and operate and wait for it to end. Something, yeah. So that's what you're trying to do. Dangers. Communication is perhaps totally disrupted, and I would say probably, not possibly, or perhaps. Another big thing, and this happens in all organizations, is failure to step up and acknowledge, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I don't have any idea what to do. I don't know what's causing this. That's very rare that you'll see any individual person or organization step up, especially a leader, and say that. And you have to do that to recognize that you're in a chaotic situation. And then this is, I mentioned this word earlier, this is a military kind of a term. Proportionality may not work. Proportionality is you have this problem here, and the amount of action, whether it be money or force or military force or coercion or heat or in a process that is required, you normally only want to use the minimal amount, the exact amount you do to make that happen because you exacerbate the situation if you overshoot or undershoot. So you want to be proportional to whatever you're trying to address. Doesn't work in chaos. Whole different animal, whole different set of things. You got to throw the proportionality concept out the window and bring out the hammer. Create your space with as big a hammer as it takes to create your space. And by space, I mean time and space. Next, run. Okay, what's happening here? Plannings, actions, and constraints when you get in each one of these scenarios. And this one, I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but on the constraint part, that's constraint on the people inside your team, inside your actions. So in the simple one, they're highly constrained, essentially no freedom. What that means is you got a checklist. Something happens and they pull out something happens and they don't pull out the checklist and they screw up, what happens? You hammer them because they've already got that. There's no decision making. There's no thing. Away you go. Complicated, still low engagement. Because what? Everybody can understand that there is cause and effect. Not everybody may understand it right now, but they know there is cause and effect. At least a goodly number or percentage of your people recognize the actual cause and effect. So it doesn't require maximum engagement by the whole team in a complicated scenario. Complex scenario, it's all hands on deck. Now it's all hands on deck because you don't know cause and effect. It's out there, nobody's understanding it. So now you've got to get a team. You used experts in the last one, you keep them on. Now you go outside and you get multiple organizations to work together in a complex scenario. Multiple organizations. How easy is that? Not easy. Not easy. That's why it's high engagement. Okay. Limited constraints, you got all kinds of freedom. If you're going to be successful, you got to give them all kinds of freedom to act. And most importantly, you have to give them the freedom to fail. They have to have the freedom to fail, or you're not going to get yourself through complex situations. Then you drop down to the final one, lower left, chaotic, active disengagement. Why that? Why active disengagement? Because the things you are doing are exacerbating the problem, because you don't have any idea what's causing the issue and the facts, and you're trying to do things that fit in your normal framework, and they're making it worse. This is a butterfly effect style scenario. The things you're doing are making it worse. So you have to stop. You stop what you're doing, and you take the constraints and you react totally to the situation at hand with minimal action at the time, except to save yourself, create your boundaries, create your space and time. Next run. And here's the one I think, I really think this is one of the most important slides out here, and that's because of the kind of light colored arrow that goes clockwise throughout this slide. And this is our intention as individuals and groups. And our intention as individuals and groups is to get out of chaos absolutely as fast as we can. Okay? We just want to get out. That's what we want to do. There's no way we can fix it. We can't be successful in it. We want to get out. And so how do we get out? Well, more than likely, we're going to have to transition back through a complex scenario. And then our desire is to get rid of some of that complexity and move that into the complicated. And finally, everybody in the world wants to finally reduce every action down to a checklist. So that's the desired action in all these scenarios, is clockwise from chaos. Now, it doesn't work. Obviously, but that's the desired scenario, is to move clockwise on things. And you can see here that in chaos, you stabilize. All you do is set your boundaries, stabilize yourself, stabilize your time, become safe, and then establish a direction. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then explore, discover, apply. As Glenn said, that's where you do some experiment, some trials. That's in your complex scenarios. And then move on around until you can get this explicit knowledge. Now, by the time you get to complicated, you want to be able to write this stuff down where people can use it. Next run. This is the one we talked about with Olin this morning. You have the interactions now. Scenarios and situations are continually moving back and forth between these four things. They may go from complex to complicated and chaotic. There are really, as far as we know and have seen around, there's not any long-standing chaotic situations. They fizzle out pretty quick. That's not necessarily true in the chemical world or in the mathematical world, but in the human world, they do. Chaos does not reign for very long. It doesn't happen. So if you can maintain your stability in case, odds are you can wait it out and it'll dissolve. Not totally, but it'll dissolve out of chaos and now becomes predictable. Except what happens is, and what you have to watch for, and this is all those red danger points on the slide, at the bottom of the slide, it's absolutely possible to fall off the cliff from a simple scenario where you think you're using a checklist into chaos. And it can be triggered by a butterfly like it. It can be triggered by one event that changes the context of the scenario so dramatically that the whole system goes into chaos. Now, it may not last very long, but at the time when you're in chaos, you have no idea what to do. You're just confused at the time. And that's what happened to Olin in this morning when he was describing. He suddenly said, crap, what happened? And that's the scenario. So it is possible to fall off the cliff and go directly from simple into chaos. Next. Yes, Black Swan was an example, but I didn't include it. Otherwise this goes from longer than I have it to even longer. But I did read about the Black Swan effect. Now this is a graph, and this is our typical bell curve graph that we use to describe all kinds of issues that we deal with. And this one essentially is your distribution of your decision-making or your planning. What's the general type of thing? Well, on the left-hand side, where it's simple, when you're mostly in the simple scenarios, it's mostly command style things where things are dictated. You have a checklist, you have things, and there is an absolute direction. You have not much wiggle room at all about as far as what to do. That's the far left. The whole great middle of it is a collaborative majority kind of a thing. Now you still have a leader who makes in most cases, you have one leader who makes the final decision, but they rarely make it themselves without talking to somebody and other people. And so that's this whole big 85% of your decision-making is in that. And then out in the right-hand side, consensus, that's where you now have to get teams of people outside your organization. So you now have teams of organization in there, teams of organizations in there. And you have to get some kind of consensus. And we're going to talk about why you have to do that here in a little bit. Next run. Now, in a crisis situation, and this is, I thought this slide did very well at looking at what is a crisis situation. So this is very much kind of a simple scenario that you see here. Set of wooden blocks or dominoes or things, looks pretty simple. One thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. Except once it starts, that's really bad because the whole system can go like that. So you have to, in that crisis, you have to act quickly, get your hand out there between those blocks and stop this, what's going on. So in a crisis, one of the most important things to do is when you see it happen, you have to act. You can't dither around, you can't plan, you have to act in a crisis. Next, Ron. Now, here's the thrust of what I was trying to see if is possible in the present. Is it actually possible to plan for chaos? Next, Ron. So here's, and we've talked about this in generalities, and there's no other way to talk about it really, because most of us have not ever been in chaos on things. But the goal here is to have less chaos and more control. And so one of the interesting things as I was doing my research, and I read this in several different places, is that there's actually no correlation between having a plan and an improved response in a crisis or in chaos. And I found that to be really interesting that we spend all these time. Why? Well, one, the documents are too big, too long, too complicated, and people don't use them. They get them, they throw them in the desk drawer, they don't even read them because they're too thick on the thing. So you have a plan, oh, you got a plan for this, yeah, but nobody's read it and they didn't buy off on it in the first place. And so it essentially becomes useless, even though you spent all this time in doing it. The planners feel really good about the plan. They're very, very proud of it, but the people who execute the plan do not because they weren't consulted when they put the plan together. So when they open up the plan that says, do this, it makes no sense because the actual guy in the field says, we can't do that. We can't do that. It's impossible to do that. And the other bad thing about this, and this is why there's somewhat of a negative correlation, is there's a very false sense of security when you get your plan done. You said, oh, we've got a great plan for this. We've covered all the bases. We've got everything good and we got this. So whatever happens, we've got 1,000 decision trees in here. We're going to be good to go. And then it falls apart. So that's the thing. However, and this is the bottom line of this, you don't want to stop planning. The actual act of planning is very, very beneficial because it does the one thing we've talked about 3 or 4 slides ago. It starts to build up that tacit knowledge in everybody that does the planning, because they have to think about scenarios they haven't thought about before. They have to think about how to standardize and process and how to transfer their information onto other people. They have to think about doing an experiment or doing something to see what they actually want to put in their part of the plan. So just because having a plan is not effective doesn't mean you shouldn't plan. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Okay, next run. Now, the most important thing in any plan is the end state, success. How do we know we win? What's the thing? So you have to first of all state what's the nature of success. How are we going to know we won? And in order to do that, you have to understand your context. And that word's going to come up in every single slide that you ever do. And that context gives you the plan starting point, where you start. Then you have a whole list of assumptions, which are all going to be wrong, but you have to have them anyway. You have to have a set of assumptions to start with, or you can't do a plan. And getting to the finish line or end state, the most important thing, is to be able to write down in one sentence what success is. Has to be one easily understandable sentence. This defines success. And we always used to say in the military, that's when they give you the quarter, you put it in the phone, and you phone, and you say, we're done. We did it. And you only can do that if you look down here and you've accomplished what it says to do. In many cases, the whole mission is to plan how to plan. That's the successful part of it, is teaching people how to plan. Establish a goal. Again, in the military, we use this little phrase, in order to. Any plan, the success statement of the plan, the end state, says we are going to do this, this, and this in order to establish a secure boundary and remove the government, or whatever the answer is. And so that's what your statement looks like. We're going to do this in order to accomplish some goal. So if you remember those words, then you'll be able to write a good mission statement and that'll really help your planning. Then after you have the in order to, then you do general guidance, general outlines, and then even if you get it out to the teams and you do more specific acts, more actions. And that's how you start. So you start with the in order to, some general guidelines from the management and intermittent leaderships, and then the specifics are developed, built, and designed by the guys in the trenches who do the work if you're doing the planning right. Next front. This is one of my favorite slides in here. I really love this word. I came across it while I was doing my research here. Consensual hallucination. This is what you have to have in order to have a successful plan, which means all the people involved in this plan, all the major elements, they have to mentally come together and agree on the context, the whole scenario, and that this plan will work. That's the consensual hallucination. There may or may not be true, but they have to believe that. They won't succeed without the buy-in. Participants and leaders have to accept their roles. If you push this thing down into the execution level and you haven't vetted it with them, the plan's not going to work, because they're not going to buy their role. People at that level are not going to buy their role in the thing. It becomes the best when you have a collaboration of shared ideas, when everybody now agrees with those ideas and they hear about them and it becomes part of their tacit knowledge. It gets passed around. And I think Glenn and I have talked about monetary systems before in another venue, but monetary systems and money is probably one of the best examples of consensual hallucination. Everybody in the world has some kind of a monetary system. They have money in their countries or in their areas or in their thing, and there's nothing there. Money is nothing. It's, somebody hands you a piece of paper with a number on it. And for that, you can get a car. Well, that makes no sense. This thing, what kind? Well, that's this consensual hallucination and trust you have that this whole system works and this is actually worth something. And it seems to me it could just easily dissolve that consensual hallucination, and then your money's not worth anything. Well, has that happened? It's happened to us as a country years ago, because people lost all the confidence in the money and it becomes worthless at the time. So you have to have the confidence in the system, and money is probably the best example that we all live with every day of how that works. Of course, every plan's a living document. You'll hear that from all the planners and anybody that ever does it. Context changes daily, so you have to review it. Inertia and trust, that's part of the hallucination. Inertia fights against it. Trust fights for it. So inertia keeps you from having a good plan because people do not want to change. They want things to be the way they were because they understand that. And in the current parlance, what about flip-flops? Okay, and we hear that all the time, and there's a real negative connotation to flip-flopping. Okay, well, 5 years ago, this person was all over item A, and item A was the best thing since sliced bread, and they were 100% behind this idea and concept, and now they're 100% against it. How can they do that? Well, they do it because the context has changed. If they're a rational person, and they actually are not doing it for some other reason, which also happens, but if they're doing it for a rational reason, and this should happen. Flip-flopping absolutely should happen. It's mandatory that it happens because contexts change. And when they change, we should change. And what was important and rational 5 years ago may be totally the wrong idea now. And so we shouldn't criticize people for flip-flopping on their positions. Next round. Okay, what to do? This is the next few slides we're going to talk. Okay, what can you do? What are some ideas? How do you react to a chaotic situation? First thing, and we talked about this somewhat initially, is you cannot beat chaos. You cannot control it. You cannot bound it. You cannot, it's beyond your control. You can only tranquilize it right near you. So this is once again where you have to just create a scenario where chaos is not in control, right near you. You have to gain your own individual control. You have to be willing to retreat from your positions, from your ideas, from your concepts. You have to be willing to retreat in order to establish boundaries. So if you stay too far out in your thinking, things will penetrate. So you may have to retreat and only have 1 or 2 or 3 things that you're absolutely, we have to preserve this things. Retreat in there so you can survive. And then you learn that in these times like this, everyone falls back on their tacit knowledge. So therefore, we have to preserve that and increase it. So inside our organizations, we have to recognize people who have it, keep them with the organization, and get them mentoring people as soon as we can. You have to learn to adjust for a long game. Well, what's a long game? When you're in chaos, a long game can be 3 minutes from now. Not, you're looking, in a world, we are instant gratification kind of people nowadays. We want, when you go to the doctor, you want him to say, this will fix you. I have looked at you, I've analyzed your situation, boom, you're brand new. That's what we want.
Going back to one of your earlier talks, I'd say the Chinese are going to win.
No, they don't have any better ideas than we have.
But they play a long game.
Well, yeah, they do, but this is chaos. They play a long games, and we can do that too. We could, but we can't do it because of our mental, the mental states we've got ourselves in here now as a country and individuals. We don't look long at all. Companies don't look long. People don't know. Nobody looks long. Not the thing. Keep yourself and your team mentally and physically well, and we see that in the COVID era now. That's even more important. Forget about what should work. It won't in chaos. You got to forget about what should work and don't waste your time. Start new. Start over. You have to stop denial, which says this isn't really bad. We're okay. You got to say this can kill us. We have got to react and do this. We have to find a new way to do something, and we got to find it now. And then be flexible and don't blame. Don't point fingers at people in your own organization or other organizations and say, you caused this. Because now you're never going to get to your collective hallucination, your collaborative hallucination if you do that. Because you've just alienated those people. They may not be in your organization, but you need them in your team. Next slide. Anything's possible. Now, we talked a little bit earlier, it's possible in chaos. It's also in complex series, but it's also possible in chaos. You can't control chaos, that we know, because it's by definition uncontrollable. But that doesn't mean you can't survive and maybe even thrive inside it for long enough for the chaos to dissipate. So you have to determine your own near term, your own near space future. You got to face reality with no excuses. And this is like blame. No excuses and take responsibility. Mentally and physically able. Now, in simpler times, if you're somewhere else in the chart, practice. Practice events you don't understand. Get confused. Create confusion in war games. We were talking about war gaming earlier. Create war games that, you had a great suggestion. They didn't want to hear it. Why? Because it would have created all kinds of confusion. The world hates confusion. And so we have to be able to be strong enough to create confusion and do intentionally create confusion. You have to be like in a theater, working in the theater or in a jazz band. We have to teach ourselves to improvise, to be improv people, so that we can react immediately to what's going on around us. We have to react to exactly what's going around us, and we have to complement it. That's what you do in a jazz band or in an improv theater, is you don't conflict with what's going on around you. You collaborate with it and improve it and make it bigger. So we have to practice that. Got to be in the moment, think, click, react quick, act, respond to the set of conditions you're in. Don't wish for a different one. We all do that every time. Oh man, I wish this was different. It's not different. It is what it is. Channel reliable heroes or mentors. That's getting to be really hard to do, because in our society, the scenarios we're in now, every reliable person in the universe is being slammed by somebody from some avenue. And so you end up that the reputation and the notoriety of people who actually know what they're doing gets diminished. And so it becomes really, really hard to identify these people who should be our heroes and our mentors. Key word here is, are they reliable, and do they have proven leadership skills? Remember that we're in uncharted territory here in chaos. And again, we're hoping that chaos is going to dissipate quickly. So what we want to do is pick a direction and stick to it. Don't change. Don't react directionally to what's happening. Don't play whack-a-mole. Get your team together, get your direction established, and motor on and protect your position on the thing. If you waffle, you'll flounder. In stable times, make yourself better. Reconnect with yourself. Establish an own inner purpose. And then this thing in red's probably, I read this in I don't know how many different sources that talk about working in chaos, is that it's your own personal moral compass that'll get you out, and your ability to transmit that to the people around you and things. So you have to have one. You have to have a moral compass in order to do, and that's this self-analysis. And the moral compass for all of us is the intent and the will to do the right thing. That's a moral compass. We have to be totally critical of all information we get. And even now, day to day, we're getting to be that way, because we don't trust anything anymore. One of the first things I do is I look at the source immediately. Anything now, I look at the source and say, yeah, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to, if it's a certain sources. So you have to do that even more in a chaotic scenario, much more untrusting of information. Only learn to trust sources that point towards stability. That may be hard to do. Even today, that's not bad advice today when we're not in chaos, but in complexity. Anybody that's advocating for disruption, that's not the answer. Disruption is not the answer. Stability is the answer. And then finally here, it's rely on scientifically originated information. And that's hard to do too, but that's what we should be doing. Lastly, before I get off this slide, is I want to talk just a little bit about the graphic at the top, because I really love the graphic on these slides. And I should have put one in with it blown up, but I think this is a great representation of the planning process in the complex and scenario particularly. Once again, by the time you get into chaos, planning pretty much is out the window. You have to have planned before you get into chaos. You don't have any time. in chaos to plan. So you plan when you're not in it, and you plan for crises and chaos. And that little graphic says, what do you have to do? How do you do a plan? And you do a plan by getting multiple people who can hold up their own weight. They can be out there, they've got ideas, they've got things to input, they're willing to play in your sandbox, and they're willing to support and be part of the things. And then you need to find the right last piece there, which is you, to come in, make that circle complete, and now you've got a plan and a group that'll work. So I really love that graphic. Whoever made that up, wasn't me. I wish it was me. It's not me. Next slide, Ron. So mathematical chaos theory. That's the first quote there. Even seemingly total chaotic systems contain the invisible seeds of order. These are the little Mandelbrot bugs and the little things and all the stuff where, patterns emerge. And if you can get far enough away, patterns emerge. Nature is always self-organizing. We have to learn how to participate in that. And then finally, when our normal systems and our normal knowledge base are no longer pointing us in a reliable direction, then it's our personal and organizational senses of integrity, morality, honesty. Those are the things that'll get us out of those chaotic scenarios. And we talked a little bit this morning as far as, okay, what have we seen recently or have been in or heard about that are actual chaotic situations? One of the few things that comes to my mind are some of the protests and the organizations we've had descended from a complex, complicated scenario into chaos, if you were in the place at the time. Inside that or on the periphery of that, all bets were off. All the people that were participating in those things went beep, and their entire logic, their moral compasses, their things all went wacko. And what happened in there was no cause and effect. And no action that you tried to do is going to stop that or influence it. And we found that people trying to do it, sometimes it made it worse. But it fizzles out of its own right. And that's an organized group of things, descended into chaos, and then the chaotic energy dissipates. And I haven't really thought of another thing that I can think of in recent memory where people have actually been involved in chaotic situations of any size, any big group or things where large government organizations or other orgs had to react. It happens all the time to individuals, like Roland was pointing out in his anecdote this morning of things. It does happen to individuals where for a few minutes, you find yourself in a totally chaotic situation where nothing fits your normal perception. Everything's out. You can't make a decision, you just can't make a decision what to do. So you're trying to react totally, but most of those time periods are very short. They go away really quickly. So hopefully, back to the one slide about multiple crises, hopefully we don't get a national or an international chaotic situation, but it's possible with the way things are going. It is possible. So next slide, Ron. Yeah, same thing on the floor at the time, because what you have in that scenario is the Mandelbrot thing is if you're up here, yeah, things are cool. If you're in the middle of that, it's chaos. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, well, and I think, I think people label the cause and effect after the fact all the time. It's a complex system for sure. It's all of the financial systems are complex systems. There is cause and effect going on inside the system, but virtually no one, I don't think anyone, obviously, understands it in advance. Nobody knows what the cause and effect relationships are in advance. They all have something to say after the fact. Oh, this was caused by somebody increased their something, or well, they are, because they have to say something. They've got a they've got a blog to write, man. They can't be quiet, you know, so,
Rational or irrational, which school are you in?
yeah, yeah, that's,
You know, it's like, what, 50 years ago, if you laid people off, that meant you had a crappy business. Now you lay people off, your stock goes up.
yeah, it's unpredictable till after the fact. Anything from the Zoomers, Ron? This slide is, and of course I have a lot of favorites in this presentation, but this is one of my favorites. Glenn is an engineer, Ron is, you know, he probably recognizes a lot of these symbols that they've just randomly inserted over numbers and letters and things to make it look complicated. I looked up a bunch of them that I didn't remember, you know, what a caret means, what the little degree symbol means. And, you know, I have a whole list of them at home that I looked up. It's okay, what's this mean? It doesn't mean anything in this instance. They just used them to make it look like a, you know, an actual formula. But what does this say? What is success dependent upon? And it's, you know, to me, after I looked at it a little bit, yeah, the success is dependent on you, me. Everything in this formula is I can do it. You have the confidence that you can. I will do it. You have the willpower to do it. I did it. Not only did I have the willpower and the capability, but I actually did it. And it was up to me to do it. And so I thought this is really kind of a cool presentation of the idea that if you're going to be successful, it's all up to you. And you got to be one of the people carrying a piece of the puzzle. Okay, Ron, am I done? Well, in a lot of cases, that's true. Because, you know, compartmentalization in most cases is designed to protect the source. And it is why they do it. So then somebody has to make a decision. Is it more important to protect the source or get the plan? And so that's what the decision for compartmentalization, and they decompartmentalize stuff all the time, because now you have to get it out where people can use it, and you can't use it if it's compartmentalized. And you're right, it's not usable when it's compartmentalized. But we talked about how important accurate, reliable information is and communication. And you can blow that away by decompartmentalizing too soon, and losing that source was that was your only way to find out that information and plug it in. So I think that's the decision to be made. But you're right, if you don't decompartmentalize, it's not useful.